Let us count how many people. Did God in the Bible kill? When he told us, "Thou shalt not kill."
It's no secret that the God of the Bible has a darker side. Throughout the Old Testament, God is responsible for a whole slew of natural disasters, from erasing life on Earth in a world-ending flood to unleashing devastating plagues of biblical proportions. Like it or not, God has a death toll. Question is, has anyone gone through the Bible and counted it, armed with a calculator, a spreadsheet, and a King James version? I have done just that. I want to figure out how many people in the Bible can list God as a cause of death. Turns out, there is a precise number, and it's in the millions. It's a horrifying statistic, especially compared with Satan, who has a measly 10. But what does this mean? What's the explanation behind this figure? All this and more as we unravel God's biblical kill count. Our search begins in the Old Testament, the section of the Bible that covers the history of Israel. Within these pages, you're never too far away from a biblical disaster, like when God engulfs an entire city in flames. This violent depiction of God has always fascinated me. It's so different to the peaceful God of the New Testament. I want to find an explanation for this behaviour, one that's rooted in the history of this book. But to know what we're dealing with, we need some numbers. How many people does God actually kill in the Bible? So I opened up a copy and began counting. It felt like going through a celebrity's Twitter feed and finding some unsavory things from the past. But instead of old tweets, it was the Old Testament. Here are some examples of what I found. And fire came out from the Lord and consumed 250 men. Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. I collected them into a single spreadsheet. This vast document records God's biblical death count. Each entry has a brief description and a corresponding biblical verse. I'm not the first to attempt this, by the way. I've relied at times on the work of Steve Wells, an author whose book and website contain a meticulously thorough list. In the Bible, deaths caused by God fall into two categories. One with exact numbers and one without numbers at all. I'll start my search in the parts where the Bible gives precise figures. Some of these biblical outbursts incur a very high death toll indeed, like when 50,070 men are pulverized for glimpsing inside the Ark of the Covenant. But that's nothing compared to the time when God sends an angel to wipe out 185,000 soldiers in one night. It's nice to see a Bible-accurate angel in this natural habitat. Other incidents are plain strange. In one story, a group of boys tease the prophet Elisha for being bald. They say, and I'm directly quoting here, "Go away, bald head. Go away, bald head." Upset by these hurtful comments, the prophet calls upon God to teach the boys some manners. Suddenly, a pack of bears appear to eat 42 of them. I'm still not sure what the moral to this tale is. Don't tease bald people? The numbers keep adding up and the total gets larger and larger. If you add up all deaths that the Bible attributes to God, you arrive at 2,559,000 449. 2.5 million. Compare that with the 10 deaths attributed to Satan. An overwhelming majority comes from the Old Testament. There are only 4 God-related deaths from the New Testament. It's a big statistic for sure, but we're not even close to the real figure. So far, we've only counted deaths where the Bible gives an exact number. We haven't added up the parts where no number is given. For example, how many people is a city or an army? 1,000? 10,000? The best we can do is use historical estimates and rely on educated guesswork. Adding them all up, the number now jumps to 4,681,116. Ouch! But there's one more event we haven't yet factored in. The Great Flood in the book of Genesis. The cataclysmic event where God decides to drown everything underwater, sparing Noah and his ark full of animals. Using the internal dating of the Bible, the year of the flood would have been 2348 BC. All we need to do now is figure out what Earth's human population would have been. Historical estimates range from 14 million to 27 million. I'm going to settle somewhere in the middle and say 20 million. Adding this to the count, we arrive at the final number. Ready for it? God's biblical kill count, including the flood and other estimates, is 24,681,116. This is an eye-watering number. To put that into context, that's approximately 34 Hochelagers. Maybe subscriber count is not a helpful metric. God's divine death toll is a statistic that some would rather not know. But again, it's using data gathered from the Bible itself. Even if we remove the flood and the various estimations, adding up the exact numbers the Bible gives us is still in the millions. So why is God's biblical kill count so high? And what does this say about God? This is a really difficult conundrum in the field of biblical studies. It's also an uncomfortable truth that's kept religious thinkers occupied. In fact, this debate goes back to the dawn of Christianity itself. In 144 AD, a Christian thinker called Marcion had an idea. What if there are 2 gods? A vengeful God of the Old Testament and a loving God of the New Testament. Marcionism, as it came to be known, was a popular theory in its day. Having 2 gods explained why there's such a discrepancy between the 2 opposite depictions of him. But Marcion and his 2 gods theory was swiftly denounced as one of the very first Christian heresies. His critics accused him of cherry-picking. You can't just remove the bits you don't like. Plus, isn't there supposed to be one God? Like it or not, the Old Testament God is here to stay. So, how else have people attempted to explain his death toll? There are plenty of religious and theological explanations for God's biblical kill count. But I think the one rooted in history is the most satisfying. To understand God in the Old Testament, you have to understand the world the Old Testament came from. To the ancient Hebrews living in 500 BC, God was depicted as a great king, ruling creation from his celestial throne in the sky. Now, an ancient king does 2 things. The first is to uphold the law. The Old Testament is full of sacred rules. There are 613 of them, like don't worship false idols and keep the Sabbath day holy. A lot of deaths in the Old Testament are because people break God's rules. Worshipping a golden calf, zap. Collecting wood on the Sabbath day, zap. Opening the Ark of the Covenant, mega zap. In every instance, people are told not to, but they do it anyway. The death penalty may seem harsh, but those are the rules. Disobey a divine law and expect a divine punishment. An eye for an eye, as the biblical saying goes. A saying, incidentally, that's been borrowed from King Hammurabi's Code, a collection of Babylonian laws that predate the Bible considerably. Like any good Mesopotamian king, the God of the Old Testament was a divine rule maker, judge, jury, and executioner too. But maintaining law and order is only half of a king's duties. What else does an ancient ruler do? He goes to war. A large proportion of God's biblical deaths are connected to warfare, whether that be granting Israelites victory in battle or using superpowered angels to demolish enemy armies. Similar to the deities of neighbouring societies, the biblical God was viewed as the protector of a nation, and so was often described as a warrior. In fact, one of the oldest bits in the Bible, the Song of Moses, is a poem praising God's military might. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the ocean. His chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. It's the closest thing you get to biblical heavy metal. The writers behind the Old Testament wanted to describe God as a powerful king. A king who upholds the law and ensures success on the battlefield. It's a gruesome affair. But hey, who said being a king was easy? Compared with other ancient deities, the biblical God is a pretty nice guy. Take the flood story. At least God is described as regretting his decision. In another version of this ancient myth, the Epic of Atrahasis, the reason why the gods drown humankind is for partying too loud. Centuries later, when the New Testament writings came along, Christian writers no longer used words like judge and warrior to describe their God. Instead, they used words like father. Now, fathers don't execute their subordinates. They forgive them, which is why forgiveness and grace are such big themes in Christianity. That's why God's biblical kill count feels so jarring. This gigantic statistic is a hang-up from the Old Testament. These ancient Hebrew writers pictured God in a very different way than we do today. To them, death was simply part and parcel of being a god. Combing through the Bible and calculating God's death toll culminates with a frightening number. It can be quite hard to make sense of. I'm not religious myself, so I find historical explanations like these the most helpful. It's one of those head-scratching questions that have kept people busy, and probably will do for centuries to come.